So that was fun. Most of my talks don't start that way. So I'm delighted to be here, and you missed one part of my bio, which is that I've been married to somebody who's taught in the independent school system for years and years and years, including for the last about 16 or 17 at Riverdale Country School. So it wasn't in the bio, but it is in my bio, so I just wanted to mention that. So thank you for inviting me to speak here today, and I'm going to talk about something that I've been doing work on for really close to 15 years now, the issue of access and affordability in American higher education. And it was fun to hear you do your business introduction, just because all of those issues that you are thinking about are issues that higher education is thinking about. So all of our sectors are related, and I think an important component of some of the challenges that our country faces. So I'm going to try to talk for, I don't know, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes, and then have lots of time for Q&A. So I'd love to interact with you on the issues that you think are important. So my topic is access and affordability in American higher education. And I'm going to start by discussing the importance to America for individuals, the economy, as well as our society more generally, particularly of higher education. And I'm going to point to some of the strengths of this sector. And then I'm going to address a variety of challenges that we're currently facing, in particular increasing the share of our population that completes a higher education degree. And again, then I'll talk a little bit about ways that I think we can move forward and leave plenty of time for Q&A. So let me start. Every now and then, and I just heard this the other day, in fact, you'll hear some politician or some pundits questioning whether higher education is appropriate for everyone, and whether we're, in fact, in the midst of a college bubble. In fact, I think it might have been the topic of an Economist article, op-ed, the editorial part recently. And I think it's probably right to say that 100% of 18-year-olds won't benefit from higher education. But usually people who are making these comments are not talking about their own children or their own grandchildren, but somebody else's. But these kinds of comments, I think, are really a distraction. Currently, only about a third, or 33%, of 25 to 29-year-olds have earned a BA in the United States. And let me just get some slides up here for you. So this is educational attainment in the US, and the slide on the left is BA attainment, and this includes associate degrees as well. So if you add the associate degrees, it goes up to about 40%. And what we're really talking about as a goal is increasing these rates. And there's a whole lot of room for increasing them before you have to worry about whether 100% is the right number. So what are the benefits of a higher education degree? Why do we think this rate should be higher than it is, if not 100%? Well, there's lots of evidence on the effects on earnings of getting a higher education degree. And current research suggests that earning a BA increases your lifetime earnings by about 65% compared to only having a high school diploma. So this is, first I gotta move it. This is the returns to various levels of earnings relative to a high school diploma being essentially the base. So you can see that it goes up by 65% if you get a bachelor's degree. Interestingly, this is actually different than in the past. Since 1980, the premium for having a BA has been increasing steadily. And the gap in earnings between college and high school graduates has actually doubled since the 1980s. Why has this changed? Work by some economists, including Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz, suggests that it's the result of technological progress that is rewarding skilled labor in the labor market, with the demand for skilled labor outpacing the growth in its supply. And what that means is just that getting a BA is a very good investment. And this is true for both men and for women. And in fact, in 2009-11, the BA high school earnings ratio was higher for women than for men, meaning that the return to going on to get a BA was even greater for women than for men relative to just going to high school. There are also benefits to our society. I'm going to skip one graph here just to keep us moving along. For example, voting is positively correlated with education levels, as is volunteering for organizations. And our country has long been committed to the idea that anyone who works hard can get ahead, and that economic and social mobility are possibilities. And these depend importantly on access to education, and not only a quality K through 12 education, but access to higher education as well. A four-year degree significantly increases your chances of moving up from one income quintile to a higher one. The higher education system in the United States is distinctive in that there's a great diversity of types of institutions, as there is in the K through 12 system. We have 2-year and 4-year institutions. We have private nonprofit institutions. We have public institutions. We have an increasing for-profit sector, and students can attend part-time or full-time. There are lots of different ways to access higher education and earn a degree after high school, and it doesn't just depend on one exam or one point in time in your life. And for much of the 20th century, we did much better than other countries in educating our population beyond high school. And this was actually partly because we were the first country to make high school available to everyone in the first part of the 20th century. But we're now facing some challenges, so let me turn to those. Problem number one, college attainment, which I mentioned of being about 33%, depending on how you define it, has basically stalled. The share of our population going on to higher education increased through much of the 20th century. It doesn't seem like so long ago, but in 1940, only 6% of 25 to 34-year-olds had a bachelor's degree. That increased to about 30% by the year 2000, and it stayed there for much of the following decade. And there's actually been a little bit increase since 2008 to that 33% that I mentioned, but it's a little hard to know whether that's a sustainable improvement or just a response to the Great Recession. When there are no available jobs, a lot of kids will go on or stay in school because they don't have alternatives at that point in time. But there are reasons to suspect that, in fact, absent actions, these rates are not going to continue to improve and might, in fact, actually decline. We can look at the demographics and see who the 18-year-olds graduating from high school will be in the coming years. And we are seeing growth in populations with lower higher education attainment rates. And if we want to see the aggregate rates go up, doing something about these particular demographic groups will be very important. Just as an example, the share of Latinos in our population is increasing, but their college-going rates are significantly lower on average. And again, just as an example, in 2012, while 33% of all these 25 to 34-year-olds had a BA, only 11% of Hispanic males did so. So more on that in a minute. Okay, other countries are doing much better than we are. The OECD reports that other countries have increased their higher education attainment rates more rapidly than we have and to much higher levels. And so this graph here just shows you the educational attainment rates in some of our other countries. And this rate includes the associate degrees, so it's a little higher. But you can see that a country like Korea is now up to educating 2/3 of its population, while the United States is down below half. So much of the rest of the world is responding to the demand in the labor market for skilled workers with increased educational attainment, but we are not. We used to be among the most highly educated societies, and now we are no longer in the top 10. We are tied for 10th, actually. Okay, so problem number 2. Who goes to college depends on income and race, and not only or mostly on merit. This is problematic because it means that we're not taking advantage of talented people, and also because notions of basic fairness are important to a functioning society. If only some groups have access to a middle or upper middle income, it's going to be difficult to have the kind of society that we claim to be, one committed to equal opportunity and social mobility. And I think we're seeing that play out across the country, in fact, over the last 12 months. So just some data. While 44% of whites have a higher education credential, only 28% of blacks do, only 20% of Hispanics, and 23% of Native Americans, with Asian Americans at 59% doing the best. Educational attainment also differs by family income. Let's see, so here, sorry, I was a slide behind here. So this is by race, and here's the data by income. So about 83% of students in the top third of the income quintile go to college, versus just a little over half if you're coming from the bottom third of the income distribution. My own research work looks at the very selective private nonprofit schools, and this includes the Ivies and the selective liberal arts colleges. And that work, which I did with a colleague of mine named Gordon Winston, suggests that only about 10% of students at these kinds of schools come from the bottom 40% of the income distribution, while about 70% of our students come from the top 20% of the income distribution. At the same time, you can look at national tests, the ACT and the SAT, and that suggests that there are significantly more talented low-income students already out there, successfully getting through K through 12, and that only about 45% of students would come from the top 20% of the income distribution based on those test scores alone. Now, test scores aren't everything, obviously, as all of you know, but they're readily available, and you can use the whole national population to look at how students are doing. And if anything, I would argue that a more nuanced measure of talent would probably suggest even greater shares of talented lower and middle income students out there, given concerns that we have about biases in standardized tests. There was some improvement in these data in 08-09, with the share of low-income students increasing a little bit. But with the Great Recession, many schools, in fact, pulled back on financial aid, so it's hard to know whether that improvement right before the Great Recession has actually been sustained as we enter this decade. So given all these data, the only way to get college attainment up in the aggregate is to get it up for the demographic groups for which it's currently low. That includes students from lower income families, and African American, Latino, and Native American families. And one other group that I'm not going to talk much about, but we could come back to in the Q&A, and that's actually young men across all demographic groups. Okay, so the third problem is costs. At a time when getting access to higher education has become increasingly important, the costs have gone up. And I want to do just a short economics lesson here, partly because I just can't resist, but I think it's also really important to understand the distinctions amongst cost, price, and net price. These are things we think about in higher education all the time, but they actually get confused by families, students, and public policy makers all the time. And I think that muddies the discussions about both what the problems are and what the possible solutions are. So the cost of producing a year of education is just that. It's the cost an institution has to pay for the inputs that produce a year's worth of education. So it's like your cost base. It's faculty salaries, it's keeping on the lights, it's materials for chemistry labs and studio art classes. The important thing is that the cost does not include financial aid or other scholarships, including merit scholarships. Those just affect the price that schools are asking people to pay for a year of education. The price, in higher education, we refer to the sticker price, or tuition, room, board, and fees, total student charges. That's what we're asking a student to pay who doesn't get any scholarship grant. At most institutions, the cost, what we spend on a year of education, is greater than the price. Most institutions of higher education are in the public and private nonprofit sector, which is why costs can exceed price, something that the private for-profits can't do for very long. The difference is covered by things like gifts, Your schools are probably out there raising money for your annual funds, as well as for endowment and for other purposes. And that plus current gifts plus earnings on the endowment and public appropriations in the public sector are the ways in which schools can spend more per student than they ask in terms of price of their full-pay kids. Costs have been going up very rapidly, way above inflation for quite a while now. And the reason is at least in part the same reason that the return on higher education has gone up. Skilled labor is being rewarded in our economy and has been for the last several decades. And higher education, like your sector, is one of the most skilled labor-intensive sectors in the economy. The other two happen to be physicians and legal services. So our costs are going up because much of our costs are compensation, and many of our workers are skilled workers who are doing well in this economy. At the same time, our sector, and this is probably true of yours as well, has not benefited from the technological progress that other sectors have experienced. We haven't figured out how to teach a seminar of 20 students with one faculty member, with more students or fewer faculty members, without significantly changing the quality of what is going on in the classroom. This is called the Baumol cost disease in economics, and the classic example that gets given is a live string quartet performance. You can't do it with fewer instruments, and you can't do it by playing faster without significantly changing the quality of the experience. Right, so prices have been going up by different amounts than cost and by different amounts in different sectors. Importantly, in our world, in higher education, prices have not been going up at the same rate as cost. They've been going up more rapidly throughout much of higher education, particularly in the public sector. And that's been happening because of reduced support from state appropriations to public higher education. And it hasn't been coming from cost increases. So schools in the public sector have responded by pushing up tuition or price, attempting to maintain quality in the face of a cutback in state appropriations. Prices have also risen in the private nonprofit, but not as much as in the public sector. So net prices are really important too. That's the price minus grant aid. And these have been moving in a variety of different directions in different sectors. Some of the private nonprofits have been allocating significantly more to financial aid and have actually been pushing down net price, or at least having its rate of increase significantly less than the increase in price. In the publics, however, which do not have a long tradition of need-based financial aid, price increases have not been matched in many cases with increased in need-based financial aid, so that net prices as well as prices have been going up in the public sector. So the bottom line is that costs are up, prices are up, and net prices are doing different things in different sectors. But overall, many, many families are facing rising prices and rising net prices, and our society has really significantly shifted the responsibility for paying for higher education away from the public sector and towards individual families. So I've got one more problem that I want to talk about, and then I'll mention some ways forward, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. So the final issue that I think is very important, and one that we haven't talked quite enough about, is rising income inequality in the United States. And it's really not unrelated to everything that I've been talking about. The share of national income claimed by the households in the top 25 and 1% of the income distribution have all increased between the 1970s and the start of this decade. And this, of course, partly reflects the return to higher education and the differing attainment rates by income level. But it's important to recognize that this increasing income inequality is not caused by a rising tide lifting all boats, with some more than others. It's actually partly the result of real earnings for men with at most a high school degree actually decreasing in real terms. Women in this group, with at most a high school degree, have had some increases, but quite modest. So this increasing income inequality is creating significant challenges for higher education. Not only is it partly a cause of it, but it's a real challenge for us. It makes it more difficult for higher education to play a role in contributing to equal opportunity and social mobility and moderating further increases in income inequality in the future down the road. It's going to complicate moving higher education attainment rates up in the direction in which we would like to see them go. So increasing income inequality directly contributes to increasing costs through the price of skilled labor. But in addition, real income growth that's skewed towards higher income families creates challenges because the highest income families are willing and able to pay the full price. And schools actually compete for these students, supplying the services that they desire, which pushes up our costs further. So single rooms, great food, smaller classes, great faculty, career counseling services, organic lawn care, to name a few. At the same time, many schools have been committed to recruiting and educating a socioeconomically diverse student body, but the lower income families' incomes are lagging behind the top groups because of increased income inequality and actually falling in real terms in some cases, so they need more financial aid. And that makes the commitment to financial aid significantly more difficult to sustain. So challenging on both ends of that income distribution. So what are the ways forward? Again, just to be clear what the goal is, I think it's to try to get more people through higher education and to have the option of getting a BA available more broadly across income levels and race in America. This is in part because it's the only way for us to increase aggregate educational attainment, but also for equity reasons. And again, the reasons are that higher education increases the well-being of individuals, but it also strengthens our economy and our society. So they're public and not just private reasons for doing this. So what are our options? I just want to make sure I leave lots of time for Q&A. We can allocate more resources to higher education, more public resources to higher education. This seems like a straightforward response. We're a very wealthy society. We should be able to do this. But at the moment, it actually seems unlikely. With a slight strengthening in the economy, we're seeing a little bit of increase in state resources for the public sector higher education. But we're continuing to see state and federal budget issues as well as political gridlock. And so I think significant changes in this area seem unlikely, at least for the near term. Also, in the future, in some ways, to get more public resources allocated to higher education, I think we're going to have to tackle some of the other major claims on public resources, discretionary public resources, which include healthcare costs and prison costs. And we really need to tackle those issues at the same time that we address higher education. So option 2, realistically, families are going to be asked to bear more of the costs of higher education for their children rather than taxpayers. And since many of the benefits are private, in fact, some personal investment actually, I think, makes sense. But we do need to worry about families who don't have the resources to make these investments, even though they'd like to, and even though it would be in their interest to do so. And so here, I think federal loan programs are very important, and I see a couple of issues that we need to think about. First, all the worry about loan burdens is in fact a little bit misleading and worrying. When the press decides to report on loan burdens, instead of reporting actual data, they tend to report the disaster stories, which of course do exist and make for a better story. But the data actually suggest that of those who earned a BA in 2011-12, 60% had debt, so 40% didn't, 60% had debt, and the average for that group was about $26,000 over 4 years, so 26 total. That is more than justified by the increased earnings. 65% higher lifetime earnings more than justifies this investment. So borrowing is a good strategy. And I worry that the stories about the terrible impact about debt are not going to dissuade higher income students or even middle income students with educated parents from going on to college, but may in fact keep exactly those families who should borrow to invest, who don't have the resources to do it out of their personal resources, from actually doing so. So limiting loan programs would, of course, be the worst response, but making sure that everybody has access to them, I think, is incredibly important. I do think another issue we can come back to, I think there are ways, even though the average debt is $26,000 and the average return on getting a BA justifies this, of course, some people will find themselves in a situation where they are having trouble paying it back. And there's been lots of research work done on this, and there are ways to tie the repayment of your student loans to what you are making that can eliminate some of the problems with taking out student loans. The way I think about loans a little bit is the old strategy of low tuition at the publics had taxpayers paying for public higher education. And to the extent that those with higher education made higher incomes, they became the future taxpayers who then helped fund public education for the next generation. Now what we're really doing is linking it more explicitly to those who get higher education and borrow from the federal government and then pay back the loans down the road when they're earning more, and then that money can get lent out to the next generation. The third option that I think exists for addressing some of these issues is that while it's not likely that we're going to have significant increases in public resources soon, we could reallocate existing resources to try to improve outcomes. And this seems like a slightly more likely outcome. Historically in the United States, the public sector has transferred resources to higher education and K through 12 through a variety of channels. For us, it's grants, subsidized loans, special tax treatment, appropriations, leaving decisions in many cases to the institutions of higher education on how to use those resources best. With greater unhappiness on the part of the public and policymakers with outcomes, we're seeing more focused targeting of this public support as a possible option. And again, I see this as a much preferable option to cutting back on public support as a response. President Obama's proposed rating system is an example of this. For those of you who have followed that, there's lots of discussion taking place, lots of criticism, but the idea that the government can ask colleges and universities to be responsible for the support that they receive actually seems reasonable to me. The trick is to get the incentives appropriate so that you actually encourage the desired behavior and that you worry about unintended consequences, which can happen if you haven't really thought it through carefully. Just as one example, if too much emphasis, for example, is placed on earnings, you might create an incentive for people not to go into sectors of the economy that don't pay as well, but in fact are incredibly valuable socially to our society. And teachers would obviously be one example for that. A final option for addressing all these issues would be if somehow we could benefit from the productivity advances that other sectors in the economy have experienced. And here technology may be able to play a role. The MOOC revolution, massive online courses, has gotten a lot of attention, and there continues to be discussion of this revolution creating significant disruption, particularly for higher education, although I think the initial hype around MOOCs has calmed down. In thinking about MOOCs making higher education institutions obsolete, one could ask why public libraries didn't have the same impact. Free access to all the course materials you might need, why go to college? Of course, there are differences, but the completion rates on MOOCs suggest that some of the similarities may be greater than at first appearance suggests. I also think that to some extent all the hype around MOOCs made it difficult to actually have reasonable discussions about how technology might actually help us reduce costs and maintain quality at the same time. And that work is now actually starting, and I'm hoping that we can make some progress. It would actually be wonderful if we could figure out a way to educate more students at the same quality level at lower cost. That would benefit our society tremendously. So in conclusion and summary, just greater investment in higher education would increase the well-being of Americans, individually as well as collectively. And I hope we can find ways to do this, but we face some significant challenges. So.